Hey there, it is time once again for Q&A Wednesday. Have a great topic today, but first, really quickly, I just want to tell everybody thank you for the support that we had this weekend. We had, back-to-back shows for competing, and our competitors did awesome. So thanks to everybody who cheered us on and came to the shows, and it was great. It's a done season for fall. Now we're already looking at spring. So if competing is something that you've ever thought about, now's the time to talk about it because it's coming really, really fast. I know it's just getting cold finally, but it is time to start talking about it. We're only 21 weeks out from the Empire Classic. So, so we're going to talk today a little bit about, whether or not you should cut carbs. And, I've had a lot of people who, we hear about type 2 diabetes, and that it's kind of an epidemic now, or a pandemic, if you want to even call it that, in our country. But there's a reason why it's here. And it's actually, the sad thing is it's a simple solution, but it's so difficult. I know that that's kind of a conundrum there. But we're going to talk about why it's so important to really pay attention to what you're doing, because the things that we do now and the things that we do when we're younger have such an effect as we get older. And that's why, of course, type 2 onset has been an adult onset disease. But unfortunately, it's trickling down now into children. It's becoming pediatric and even infant bound, which is really fascinating. And the research that I do on it is pretty interesting. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But first, I really want to talk to you a little bit about whether or not you should cut carbs. Now, of course, I have my own opinion on this, but some of it's just a little bit of common sense, and I'm not quite sure why people have none. But let's talk a little bit about what carbs are. It's fascinating to me when I get new clients all the time, and most of them have no idea what macros are or what they do. And you know what? Honestly, we're not taught that in school. I really find it fascinating that school prepares us for all these things except life. And as a former school teacher, yes, I find that fascinating, why we can't do a better job at that, because we're really kind of bringing, our children into real life, ill-educated, and just not ready to live. So, let's talk a little bit about what macros are. Some of you have heard it, some of you have just heard like kind of the catchphrases about it. And don't really know what that means or what they each do, because, the macronutrients are important. Those are the three main foods that we eat, which of course include proteins, carbs, and fats. Now, they each have their own purpose and they each do their own thing, and your body responds to them a little bit differently. So in the past, I've talked a little bit about, when is a calorie not a calorie? And honestly, calories really, to an extent, don't matter. Your body just treats each of those different macronutrients differently, and because they do different things for your body. So proteins, of course, is your, the amino acids are what helps you to build and maintain muscle. The carbs is your energy source. Now, again, we're going to come back in a second and talk about the better choices of that. But in general, even if you think about the fact that it's when you need that energy, that's of course what carbs provide. Problem being is if you provide your body all the energy it needs through the carb source, why would it burn fat for fuel? So of course, keep that in mind as we talk about this tonight, but also, and we also need to eat fats. Now, fats have gotten such a bad rap, and there's a whole story behind us to how it's gotten there. Actually, believe it or not, a politician decided on our governmental, what do you want to call it, focus on how we look at food and what causes us to gain weight, which I find really crazy fascinating. But fats are actually hugely beneficial. They actually help us be satiated. They trigger certain things, certain hormones in our body that tell us that we are full. And so, of course, just like everything else, there's some good fats and some not so great fats. But in general, fats have gotten a huge bad rap. But they do help us to break down all and utilize all the other nutrients. They also help us synthesize our hormones. So it's really super important that we get those in there. Low fat was a really big deal in the early 90s. And unfortunately, I think it's really steered us in the wrong direction. And of course, now the scales have tipped a completely different direction. Now the big deal is, of course, low carb, no carb, keto, blah, 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 blah. I personally don't like diets. I don't think that there's any one right way for people to eat. I think there's some great guidelines, but I think that, anytime a diet kind of consists or denotes that you are going to sacrifice for something or sacrifice something to get to somewhere, that you're going to feel the pain. The problem being is that I think we're really on the wrong track. Downside to diets is calorie reduction does not work. And it doesn't work. It might work for the short term because, of course, most of us can do anything for a short season, but in the long run, it actually, our body's like a thermostat. If we're a certain weight, our body's going to try to keep us there. So if we eat more than we're supposed to, our metabolism revs up and tries to burn that to keep us where we're at. The problem is that when we really go very low calorie, like I really feel like ideal protein and the HCG, whatever the heck that diet is, I think it's done us a huge disservice. First of all, it's because we believe it should work because doctors came up with that. But you know what? The doctors, bless their hearts, they have an incredible education. Unfortunately, that education does not include a whole lot about nutrition. And so they're ruining people's metabolisms by putting them on such a low calorie diet that all their body does drops down and goes, you know what, I'm starving. So I'm going to just hold on to all this fat that I possibly can because I don't know what I'm going to eat again and get enough calories. So again, it's very frustrating, but when you eat too little, your body, actually your metabolism lowers to deal with that, and it tries to preserve the fats that you already have because it doesn't want you to die. Your body has two goals. Two specific goals that you don't even have to think about or know about. Number one is to survive. Throughout history, that's what the human body is designed for. So in times of no food or famine, that it can live off its fat stores in order to survive. Your body also wants to, of course, avoid pain, and so it will do whatever it takes to do that as well. The downside to that is that, in today's day and age where everything is so convenient, food is convenient, we have more than enough, at least most of the world, to live, right? And so unfortunately, we're not burning off a lot of that fat stores that we might, be building as we're eating a lot of foods that actually promote that. So let's talk a little bit really quickly about carbs in general. Of course, it is the one macronutrient that is an energy source. And just like the other macronutrients, there's some options that are not so great, and there's options that are great, or that are a much better option. Now, so the problem, this kind of leads into the insulin resistance. So we'll talk a little bit about that. I am not a fan of cutting out any nutrient. When people say, well, I just need to cut carbs. Well, maybe that might be true, but I don't think that you need to cut them completely out. The downside to cutting out a complete nutrient is that you're going to miss out on the vitamins and minerals that it can provide you. Now, you have to agree that not all macros or not all carbs are the same. First of all, a simple sugar is a completely different option than a complex carb, right? Because a simple sugar pretty much hits your system or your bloodstream really, really quickly, raises your blood sugar, which then your body then has to deal with, okay? A complex carb, because it contains a lot more, not necessarily vitamins and minerals alone, but the fiber alone will actually slow down the absorption rate of the natural sugars in the product. So an apple, okay, so let's just talk about like an apple versus a Pop-Tart, which is what I use for my picture today, because they're both simple sugars, right? They both break down fairly quickly into the bloodstream as sugar, but of course, one is a processed food with virtually no nutritional value whatsoever. A Pop-Tart is made of highly refined sugars, products in general, flour. There really is, when they talk about empty calories, that's kind of what we're talking about, because yes, it might give you energy per se, but it's not giving you vitamins, it's not giving you minerals, it's not giving you anything that your body really needs in order to function. And I think we forget that it's not just about the energy source, right? We need those products in order to flourish, right? Our microbiome needs those things. So in order to live our healthiest, most efficient lifestyle, we have to eat the right foods, right? So Pop-Tart, while, again, I believe in balance. Pop-Tart once in a while is not a big deal. Same thing with just sugar in general, because of course we all know that sugar is a drug. But, once in a while it's okay. The problem is that, in the United States, that's our lifestyle. That's our daily nutritional intake is a bunch of processed garbage. Versus the apple has, vitamins in it. It's got the fiber in it. Our bodies were designed to eat those kind of foods. So when we talk about whole, clean foods, and I know that there's some, derogatory thoughts when people think about that, but in general, that's what our bodies were designed to eat. Plenty of fresh fruits and vegetables and things that were grown. I'm also a firm believer in proteins. We won't get into, vegetarians and vegans, but we all kind of have the same thought process. We just believe in finding our proteins a little bit differently. But there's such a big difference in the types of carbohydrates that we're talking about right now. So, if you're going to cut out something, cut the crap. Don't cut the carbs. Okay. Does that make sense to people? Again, there's a big difference between that Pop-Tart and maybe some sweet potatoes, even regular potatoes can be a good option as long as you're not overdoing it, or you don't have tendencies towards diabetes, because of course that is a little bit, it's passed down throughout the family, as well as some of the things that we do to ourselves. But there's just better options there. So again, I'm not saying that you have to eat a high carbohydrate diet. What I'm saying is you don't have to cut it completely out. I really think that people are just looking at carbohydrates as a whole, that they're bad. And that's not how it is. It's like the other macronutrients, where some have some good options there, and then some not so healthy options. Anything that is refined and processed and that has additives and preservatives, which our body just doesn't know how to deal with, those are the problems that we're talking about. They're just not the healthy options. So, we're even talking about things that you can make at home. I know that, I love to bake. So I know that sometimes that's so hard. But, muffins, bagels, you guys, those are not healthy foods. They are made from refined and processed products or ingredients. So, of course, once in a while it's okay, like we just said. But if we're living on that on a regular basis, bread, especially white bread, foods are not the way they were 100 years ago. So even the things of today, like bread, is just not the same breakdown. So here's the problem with eating too many carbs. Now, again, too much of anything, even good things, can be a problem. So I'm bringing this really great book. I don't know what I did with it. I have it sitting here somewhere, called The Obesity Code, by Jason Fung, I believe his name is. And I really like his concepts. I've been listening to him on some lectures that I've been listening to. And what I really love is when I hear concepts and kind of the research behind it on things that I already have kind of figured out, because then it gives me a really good basis to stand on when I'm talking to people and teaching people about how their bodies work. So the problem isn't necessarily the carbs themselves, it's what our body's response to it is, which of course, when we intake all that sugar, our body then has to respond by secreting insulin in order to deal with the sugars. Now, our body needs glucose, right? Our cells need the energy. The downside comes when we eat so much of it, especially when it comes from things like refined sugar, that all of a sudden, our blood sugar is constantly high, because that can actually do damage. It can actually do some neurological damage. So our body then has to secrete the insulin, and that insulin is a storage hormone. Where does it store things at? Fat, right? That is our storage unit in the body. So the more garbage and more refined foods that we eat that turn to sugar instantly in our system, the more insulin our body has to produce, which of course at some point, usually not into our adulthood. That's why, again, type 2 diabetes is usually adult onset. The problem is that it's one of those things that takes a long time coming. We just don't necessarily see it. Once we have the symptoms, the damage is kind of already done. Now, we'll talk in a minute about how, type 2 diabetes can be reversible if it's caught early enough. The sad thing is that it's totally a dietary issue. It's a dietary disease. If we eat the wrong things, we're creating this ourselves. Yes, you might have a propensity through your genes to obviously have that, which it does run in my family, so I'm already fully aware. My grandmother was a type 2 diabetic, and so is my mother. So I'm very aware that is something that, if I'm not careful, can happen. But I can keep that at bay by my lifestyle and the foods that I eat. So that becomes, something that's really important. So the problem, here's where weight gain comes from. I find it fascinating that we're still hanging on to these old ideas that fat causes fat, which has totally been proven wrong. But again, those of us that really kind of lived through the 90s, we still have this whole idea of that, well, of course, fat has 9 grams or 9 calories per gram, so it obviously causes fat. It's actually not. Insulin is what causes fat or weight gain. So, when we eat a lot of carbs, like I said, especially simple sugars and highly refined foods, we have an insulin response. So the more that we produce insulin or spike insulin, the more we store, which causes weight gain or fat gain, because there is a difference, right? I can gain weight. I'm actually gaining weight right now, but it's muscle, because I'm doing it very specifically. But that's the kind of weight we don't want to gain. So that is the specific main cause of weight gain. And then of course the reverse is weight loss, which is you have to have less insulin response. And again, I'm not saying to cut out carbs, because I think that there's a very specific reason to be eating them. I do eat carbs, but it's usually around my workouts, because I'm actually trying to spike my insulin because I want my muscle to absorb the nutrients. But you keep that in mind that it's the insulin response that causes the weight gain. We talked about that there's some good options and some not great options. Guys, vegetables are carbs. There's great options. If you can grow it, right, it's probably a good option. It's when you start having the breakdown, the process part of it, that our body responds to it, because of course it's already broken down for us. Our body doesn't have to break it down. There is a thermogenic effect of eating where, especially if it's whole, unrefined foods, our body has to heat up to break it down. We actually burn calories in order to eat and to process the food and digest it. But if it's already been done for us, right, before we eat it, we don't have to work as hard to do that. And of course, our body responds differently to it. So anything that's processed, again, is probably gonna be not a great option. I know you don't want to hear it, guys. I know you want to hear that there's some magic pill or there's some like happy dance you can do, or just drink apple cider vinegar. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea, but I'm just saying it's not going to negate eating a bunch of garbage. The same thing with there is a little bit of truth behind the net carb phenomenon. In a whole food, say an apple, the fiber does negate it slows down the absorption rate of the sugar into our bloodstream. That just doesn't happen in processed foods. I know that they promote that as a healthy thing. It has not been proven to actually work that way. The net carb thing in protein bars or whatever, it really bothers me that all of these processed foods are being touted as healthy options of things, and it's really not. It's just a gimmick. Yeah, it just is. So, keep in mind that anything that's processed is probably not your best option. Now, again, I'm not against, I keep protein bars in the house, very low sugar ones, so that, if I'm traveling, I do have some options, but I don't eat that as a regular food because even though it's a healthier option per se, it's still a processed food. So keep that in mind. You really have to kind of make some changes for a healthier lifestyle. You can eat those once in a while, but they're not a staple kind of a thing. So let's talk a little bit about sucrose and fructose. Okay, so of course, those are the carbs, the simple sugars that we really need to cut out of our diet as much as possible. Primarily because, sucrose, which is sugar, there are some major downsides to that. Number one, it is an addictive substance. I don't care what you hear, anytime you hear that, calories count, blah, 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 blah. They're really not promoting it in the right direction because not all calories count the same. But the downside to things like sugar is that it lights up the same part of the brain as cocaine. It releases dopamine, which it's the feel-good hormone. So of course we like that feeling, right? It makes you feel great for a minute and it tastes good. But then, hour later it drops you and you feel like you need more. So there's also an aging aspect to eating a lot of sugar. It actually browns the inside of your body, your organs. So again, a lot of sugar consumption is going to age your body faster. It promotes, do you see kind of a consistent theme going here? Is that sugar is not a healthy option. And we all know how hard it is to quit sugar because it is so addictive and it's just hard. I have a sweet tooth, so I know about trying to do that. And I also know how it feels when I do cut it out of my diet, meal plan, whatever you want to call it. I have physical withdrawals because my body wants more of it. So fructose, on the other hand, is actually, it's dealt with in a little different way in your body than sugar is. However, it's just as unhealthy. It causes, it can actually contribute to fatty liver disease. But both of those are not great options. Especially the high fructose corn syrup. It's a cheaper option that manufacturers of food have determined to use because, of course, it doesn't take as much because it's extremely sweet. And it's easy and inexpensive to add to their products, and of course it's still addicting. So again, they've actually shown in general that sugar and fructose, it doesn't trigger the satiation in your body. So it's almost like it confuses your body, and that's why when we're eating it, we keep eating. It's kind of like, if you've eaten a steak and maybe a baked potato, man, you're full, you can't eat anymore. Now, if somebody offers you a piece of pie, you can fit that in, right? Because it tastes good and it doesn't hit those triggers of fullness. So again, there's a downside to eating those products overall, right? And again, it does contribute to insulin resistance, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So really, your goal is to eat as much in the way of whole food. And I realize that some people don't understand what that means, because I even remember when I thought like bread, because it's whole grain, right, was a good option. The more that you can eat it as it came, right? So we're talking, like I said, fruits, vegetables, even proteins. Now, we can talk a whole day about whether or not meat products or animal products are a great option, because of course, even now there's going to be some better options than others, like grass-fed versus, but that's for a story for another day. But, the more that you can eat whole, my joke is, if you can't kill it or grow it, you probably shouldn't be eating it. Things that are only 1 or 2 ingredients is what you should be shooting for, because those are going to be your best options. And your body knows what to do with them. It knows how to get the nutrients from them. Anything that's going to be processed, I don't even care if it says, that it's vitamin C added. It's still going to be a synthetic form, and your body doesn't work with it quite as well as the real thing. Okay, so let's talk about what insulin resistance is. Insulin resistance is a precursor to type 2 diabetes. Now, we're not going to even approach type 1 diabetes. That's a whole different ballgame. It has to do with your body attacking. It's an autoimmune disorder. But type 2 diabetes is fully brought on primarily by what we eat. And again, I have this whole theory behind, someday I'm going to write a book called Toxic Children, because of course what we're feeding our children now determines what happens to them as adults. We just don't see it till the future. And so I find it fascinating when I tell people, you just need to clean it out of your house and not bring it home. And their response is, well, but what if my kids want, cheese chips or whatever the heck? And I'm going, so basically what you're telling me is you want your kids to deal with the same issues that you have, right? And they're going, well, no. I'm like, then why are you teaching them the same problems that you've had? So keep that in mind. Insulin resistance is something that comes on over time. It doesn't happen overnight. You're not going to see this. By the time you actually get the symptoms, you're kind of knee deep in the trouble already. So that's a problem. Now, the insulin resistance is your body's cells no longer know how to absorb the insulin or to absorb the glucose. So it's kind of like, the best way to describe it is like vaccines, right? We all know that if we, or vaccines or antibiotics, that's what I'm thinking of. If we take the antibiotics all the time, all of a sudden they become ineffective because our body just gets used to it, and then it no longer does the job it's supposed to do. So insulin resistance is kind of the same way, whereby your body's kind of produced so much of it. We've eaten so much sugar and so much processed food that our body can't keep up anymore. And so the way that they describe it is kind of like a lock and a key, and that key needs to fit the lock, but all of a sudden it's not unlocking it anymore. It's not unlocking the cell that needs to absorb the glucose and take it out of your bloodstream, because it doesn't know what to do with that insulin anymore. It's so tired of dealing with it. It's kind of like the ex-husband that keeps bugging you. You just kind of you stop listening at some point. Same idea. It stops being able to absorb the glucose, and so then it starts to stay in your bloodstream. What happens is you just produce more and more and more, because it can be toxic for that blood sugar to build up. And so at some point, again, your body just wears out. It doesn't know what to do with that anymore. And then, of course, so here's the downside. They treat type 2 diabetes for people who really have some issues with more insulin. Well, doesn't that sound like it's kind of adding insult to injury? I'm already not dealing well with the insulin. It's not already doing its job. I'm not accepting the glucose anymore. It's knocking, but I'm not letting it in. So if I keep giving it more and more insulin, all that does is kind of like giving it more and more antibiotics. It no longer deals with the superbug because it's worn out. Like, it already has dealt with it and dealt with it and dealt with it. It's worn out. Same idea. If you've been giving it, insulin and insulin and insulin because we've been eating sugar and sugar and sugar and sugar and processed food, all of a sudden it's producing more and more insulin, but the insulin can't do its job, because now the cells are just kind of going, I don't want it anymore. Right? So that becomes a product and a problem. And of course, that actually does lead to full-blown type 2 diabetes. Now, unfortunately, all of those situations can be dealt with within the dietary choices that we make, but most people don't want to, refuse to. I don't know, like for some odd reason, I don't understand. To me, if I'm given the choice, be miserable and possibly die, and my body shuts down, and all of these horrible things with my organs because I still am eating a bunch of garbage, I personally would make the choice, well, I already have, to just eat a healthier meal plan. I think most people just need to be educated for the first part of it. But I think that in general, our American diet has gotten so far off track that we just don't know any better. Thereby, we kind of just perpetuate it. It's diabetes has been called a chronic disease. It's unfortunate because it doesn't have to be chronic. Like I said, it can be reversed by cutting out the garbage. Now, there might be a time and place, and of course, once we get to the point where our body can't deal with much glucose at all, because carbohydrates do produce that, we might need to cut out most of the carbs. However, again, vegetables are carbohydrates, so they also have other options and other things in them that are so beneficial that, somebody who gets on more of a vegetarian diet with some proteins, is going to probably fare way, way better than someone who is still trying to figure out what to do, and still ingesting a lot of carbohydrates that are unhealthy carbohydrates. You see, there's a difference. I think that's really where we get caught up, is that we kind of group all carbohydrates together and all carbohydrates are bad, which isn't true, right? Because some of them are still very nutritious, and it's what our body needs to live. We eat for the nutrients. That's not why we think we eat, but that is why our bodies need to eat that way. Again, it's if you feel like you need to educate yourself, please do, because I feel like just, again, as a nation, we've kind of gone the wrong direction. There's things that we could be doing. We're just promoting the wrong thing. We're educating incorrectly. Even our government guidelines with the food pyramids and all of that is so incorrect as to how our bodies work. And it's actually not really based on research. It's actually based against the research, which has proven that low-fat, high-carbohydrates diets don't work, and that low-calorie diets, those don't work as well. But unfortunately, we're still touting that. So I don't know how to convince you any other way except for, try it and prove me wrong, kind of a deal. So hopefully that helps give you an idea as to whether or not that, whether you should cut carbs. If you're really not sure, shoot me a message. Let's have a conversation, because I don't mind doing that. I really want to make sure that you're living your very healthiest lifestyle, and that you can continue to have a quality life and really enjoy everything that you were put here to do. So again, have an incredible evening, you guys. I know I ramble a little bit, so sorry about that. I just get really excited. I'm going to finish reading that book. It had some really, really great ideas. He also produces a book, or has written a book called The Diabetes Code, which I know it's going to be similar, but just right specifically working with type 2 diabetes. It's become such a prevalent issue. Even now, babies and infants are being born with these issues because, of course, how the mother eats. But again, topic for another day. I find it fascinating. So have an incredible week, you guys. There will be meals with Melissa this weekend. I'm thinking I'm going to do a low-carb pumpkin bread. So if that's up your alley, you'll want to stay tuned. That is Saturday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Also, please make sure that you leave a message below. I get my best ideas from you guys. Again, these are all questions that a lot of my clients ask. I just figure let's teach everybody at the same time. So have an incredible night, you guys. Stay warm, and until next week. Bye now.